Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On today's episode, I'm talking to the wonderful Christy Lefteri. Brought up in London, Christy is the child of Cypriot refugees who escaped the partition of 1974. She released her first novel, A Watermelon, a Fish and a Bible, in 2010 and went on to release The Beekeeper of Aleppo in 2019. The latter became a Sunday Times bestseller and winner of the 2020 Aspen Words Literary Prize. It's an urgent telling of the lives of refugees enduring the humanitarian crisis in the Mediterranean. I thought it was brilliant. Christy's latest novel, Songbirds, sheds light on the plight and crises domestic workers in Cyprus face. Hi, Christy. Thank you so much for joining me today for this episode of The Diverse Bookshelf.
Hi, Sammy. It's so great to be here and thanks for inviting me.
Oh, I'm really excited. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so my first question is, did you always want to be a writer?
Yes, literally that's the truth. I did always want to be a writer, or from as far back as I can remember. So I would say from about 9 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I remember when I was still in primary school, I pretended that I had my own magazine.
Oh.
And I'd write little stories in the magazine, and there'd be like different articles, and I'd write them in columns, and there'd be pictures and all sorts of things. And there were news articles and feature articles. And I don't know, we must have done it at school. So I wrote a few news ones on the front page and then some feature ones. And then what I did is which wouldn't have been good for the trees, but I printed up like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 versions of the magazine that I'd created, and then sort of pretended to sell it to people. So I remember doing that, and I was really excited at the thought of writing something that I then printed up, that there was then another version of it, so that 2 people or 3 people or 4 people could read it at the same time. Something about that excited me. And also, I think, so when I was in year 4, my English teacher thought that I wasn't good at English, and she put me in the, inverted commas, special class. And my parents got really worried, and I've spoken to her since as well. So my parents got really worried, and they spoke to her and said, what can we do? And she said, well, if you can afford to get a tutor, that might help. So they got me a tutor, and the tutor, after about 2 sessions, because it took him 2 sessions to kind of assess me, he turned around and said, I believe that she's going to be an author and do a PhD in writing.
Oh,
and he was absolutely right. And my mum was like, but the teacher said she wasn't good. And he said, she's just daydreaming, that's all. So I was sitting in the lesson like, just daydreaming and making up stories, because I thought that's what I was supposed to do, because we were in English, and the teacher was looking at me going, oh God, this girl doesn't know anything. Let's give her extra help. But it turned out that I was just trying to make up stories. And then so years later, she contacted me on Facebook when Beekeeper came out. And she said to me, I'm really proud of you. And oh my God, do you remember when I put you in the special class? And anyway, we ended up meeting up and going for dinner and stuff. And we both thought it was completely hilarious. And she said, see, we should like be more open in terms of, we might see a child that's not answering any questions and not actually engaging, but actually they are, but in their own way. So that was me.
Absolutely. I guess it just goes to show that school is not really a test for creativity and talent in so many ways.
You're absolutely right about that. And I was a teacher for so many years, and I always had that in my mind. And so when I was teaching students, I'd think, don't jump to conclusions about that child, because you don't know at all what's going on in their head. There might be so much. And like, for example, I remember this one, because I did some tutoring as well. And I remember this one dad said to me, oh no, his son, he said, oh, my son's really bad in English and blah, blah. And then on the first lesson, I set him some homework, and it came back and it was with the dad's handwriting. And it was definitely not the kid's handwriting, because he was about 8. And or no, maybe he was a bit older. He was about 10 at the time. And And I said to the dad, did you do the homework? And he was like, yeah, I did it. And I said, but why? You're paying me to teach your son. I said to him, right, do not ever do that again. You're going to do that again. Go and find another teacher. And he was like, oh my God, okay, sorry, I won't do it again. But you won't be able to read his handwriting. And it was true. The kid's handwriting was going sideways. It was a complete mess. I couldn't read it. And I said to the kid, can you read it to me? Because I said to him, look, I'm not going to lie to you. I can't read what you've written, but please, can you read it to me? And he read it to me and it was beautiful.
Oh.
And do you know what looking at it, there was no way I could have known. And when his dad came back, I said, do you know, he's got such an imagination. He said, how do you know? And I was like, you were right, I couldn't read it, but he read it to me. And we spent a year with that kid reading his work to me. And then he did an A-level in English. I know I've gone off the topic, but sometimes you just don't know what's going on in a child's head. And I always knew I wanted to write. When that tutor started to teach me, I would write stories for him week after week after week. And I just knew that's what I wanted to do. And it never went away.
Oh, that's so lovely. That's really lovely. And I'm so glad as well. Well, I think the world is very glad that you stuck to it, that initial teacher didn't get you too down. So when it comes to writing, what inspires you?
So where that was a kind of jolly answer that I gave you, the first one, this is a more sort of somber one, because the kinds of things that inspire me are things that like tend to break my heart. So see something or hear something, I don't know, I might see something on, like for example with Beekeeper, I was following the news about what was happening with the refugees, just like we're all following the news now with what's going on in Ukraine, and just feeling this sort of like, how come I'm safe here in my house? And there are these people that are so unsafe and so frightened. And then I remember, which I might have told you last time we spoke, that I was visiting my dad in Cyprus, who lives on the east side of Cyprus, which literally faces Syria. And I was just there looking out across the water and thinking, if I just got on a little boat and went across the water, I'd be in Syria, and how different would the world seem? And then I started thinking that in 1974, when my parents became refugees, like how it would have been for someone in Syria looking over to Cyprus and wondering what kind of broken hearts and broken lives and broken families had kind of become as a result of the war that was going on then. And so that kind of really got to me. And so I went to volunteer. Because sometimes when it links with your own family or something and you say, I just want to do something. So I decided to go and volunteer with refugees in Athens, because I wasn't going to go to Syria. It was too dangerous. And then just seeing children coming in, and from Syria, but also from Afghanistan and also from other parts of the world, and seeing what it meant to families to have been going through those things there and there in front of me. So not separated by screen, but looking down into a child's eyes and seeing both fear and hope and all sorts of things, and seeing how they played with each other. These are the kind of things that inspired me for Beekeeper. And then for Songbirds, again, it was something really similar. I was talking to a friend of mine, and I said to her, I'm thinking about my next novel. And I said to her, I want to write something that touches my heart in the same way that the themes in Beekeeper touched my heart. And she knows what kind of person I am. I've known her for like more than 20 years. And then one day I woke up in the morning and she'd text me a link to an article, which was about 5 women and 2 children that had gone missing in Cyprus. But because they were foreign, the police refused to search for them. And then I won't say what came about, because that's the story of my novel. And because I had developed a really close friendship with a domestic worker in Cyprus, who lived with a family member, we were like the same age, and she'd left her 2 daughters in Sri Lanka in order to earn enough to give them an education, because her husband had died. And I was going through a divorce, and we became really close friends. So then when I read this article, it really broke my heart, because I was like, no, it wasn't her, but it could have been her. And so again, it was that thing that's sort of like, it's almost like someone reaches into your heart and grabs your heart, and like kind of, it's like an emotion that captures you and you can't let go, you can't forget it. That's what inspires me to write.
Yeah, wow, that's really inspirational. And it's something that I think a lot about as well. So I work in the charity sector and I work in comms as well. So I do a lot of storytelling and I get a lot of information from the field, and sometimes I have to turn it into something readable or relatable. One of the things I struggle with a lot is managing the sadness that comes from that.
Yeah.
And also, I think, obviously, like you were in Athens, and I guess maybe this doesn't apply as much, but like a degree of helplessness as well.
Sure. Yeah.
So how do you sort of channel that? Or because those negative emotions are really strong, like they're very powerful. Like I have also traveled as well, and sometimes I come back and for days I can't sleep, and I find it really difficult to adjust back. So how do you channel some of those really difficult emotions?
Because I've thought about this a lot, and and I think what happens to me, the reason it affects me so badly is because, and I don't know, maybe this applies to others as well, I think usually we kind of take life for granted and we take our safety for granted. And then when we see something like that, our bubble bursts, and it reminds us of the fragility of life, of how awful the world can be sometimes. And when you see that and it's right in front of you and it touches you, it's so hard to forget about it. And it's so hard to then just snap back into living normally because you've then seen it. So I dealt with it by writing. That's how I dealt with it. That's how I processed it. That's why I wrote Beekeeper, and probably why I wrote Songbirds, because after my friend sent me that article and it touched me, I then went to Cyprus, and it was just before lockdown, and heard all these stories about these women. And also I spoke to loads of women in the UK as well. And like, for example, just hearing like a story about this woman who'd left her newborn baby in Nepal, I think it was, and that when she arrived in her new place, I think she was in Saudi Arabia first, she could hear a baby crying at night, and she would wake up and walk around the house. So if you read Songbirds, you'll recognize that bit where Nisha wakes up and she thinks there's a baby crying, and she thinks it's coming from the trees, from the ground, from the sky, and actually it's her child that she hears inside within her. And so when I heard that story, God, I was crying when I heard it. So I guess I processed it by using it somehow. I mean, I don't always as explicitly use a story, but just the process of writing, of putting something down, I think helps me to process all these different emotions. And especially now that I've got a daughter and she's 14 weeks, sometimes all these stories that I heard come back to me, and I look at her and I think, oh my God, and I feel them all afresh. Yeah. And sometimes I just can't process them. I just can't. It's just a matter of being with those feelings and, just saying, well, I do feel like these things, but there's nothing I can do.
Yeah, no, I completely get that. So you mentioned obviously that you were in Cyprus, and I think your father lives there.
Yeah.
And obviously your parents were from Cyprus as well. So how has your background brought you to writing? And I guess this is probably, if we think about the sort of the experiences that your father had in particular, and you've written and we've spoken before as well about that sort of chronic trauma and that intergenerational trauma, and how your experiences growing up and in life, how that led you to then write.
Yeah. So I remember, so my dad was an officer of the war in Cyprus in 1974, and I don't think he realized that at the time. But I definitely believe he had post-traumatic stress disorder. And I wrote that in the article that I wrote about transgenerational. I'm so interested in transgenerational trauma. I did a psychoanalytic training for about 8-9 years. And I was working as a honorary psychotherapist in Westminster, the Gordon Hospital. And so I worked with a lot of people that had trauma, but also had my own therapy to try and understand my own traumas and the effect that they had on my life. So it was while I was having my own therapy that I could kind of unpick it. and started to see my dad a bit differently. Not that he was an awful person, but he was reacting in ways that I just couldn't understand. And when I started reading more about like how trauma can pass from one generation to the other, I realized that often it's because it's unsaid. So those traumatic things are not spoken about, and therefore they are relived in some way through actions that can't be understood. And then when the child doesn't understand those actions, it becomes a trauma on them, because then they start blaming themselves, or they start, oh, but why is my dad reacting like this? I don't understand it. It's me, it must be me. You know, so I grew up with this horrible thing that I had where I was always blaming myself for everything. And it can like draw you down, because I guess my dad was reacting in certain ways and I just thought it was my fault. Because it's not like he was saying, I went through this war and I feel, because of what I saw, I feel frightened, and therefore sometimes I act more frightened. What I saw was this man that was like my God, you know, because that's what our parents are like gods to us, because we don't know any, you know, better.
Exactly.
Reacting with so much fear that then I became frightened of everything. So, for example, I remember once we went to a fairground and we got on those, not the teacup ones, but the other ones that move almost just as slowly as the teacup ones. And something happened to my dad, and he just got up and he went yellow, and he started like calling to the man to stop the ride. And the man wouldn't stop the ride, and I thought my dad was having a heart attack. And I've never been able to get on a ride ever since that day, and I think I must have been about 7 or 6 or something. And it was years later when I thought, do you know, it's something about the movement must have triggered something. And then like my uncle, his brother, told me some stories of when my dad came to England just after the war. Like he went through Europe and went through France and like ate fruit off the trees in order to survive, got to England, and my grandma, who was already here, said that he had blood in his eyes and that she didn't recognize him. And then my uncle said that he'd wake up in the middle of the night, because my uncle didn't fight in the war, he had some problem, like a sight problem, and my dad would wake up and say, get your heads down. I then, when I was like 12 or 11, I'd wake up in the middle of the night. I didn't know this story. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, run to the window, open the curtains. I had these thick velvet curtains that, you know, we all had in the 80s. And mine were pink. I remember them. And I'd open them up thinking that a bomb was going to fall from the sky. And I never knew why I was doing that. And then I was 30 when my uncle told me that story.
Wow.
And nobody mentioned it to me. And I was like, oh my God, years I was jumping out of bed in the middle of the night, running to the window and thinking there was a bomb.
Wow. And it must have been so confusing, because apart from that, you must have felt safe, like safe in your home, even safe at the fairground. Like, you know, nothing's going to happen when you get into that pickup ride. But your father was clearly didn't feel safe. That must have been really confusing.
Exactly. And so do you see how the trauma transfers itself? Because I didn't know why he was reacting like that. So I became afraid of those things without knowing why I was afraid of them. And you're right, I wasn't unsafe. So I guess, like, going back to my writing, I write about people that are in unsafe situations because I felt it in my gut.
Yeah. Like,
I feel like I truly felt it, even though all around me I was safe, technically.
Yeah, I get that. So with both Beekeeper and Songbirds, I think you write with like a humility, which I really appreciate as a reader, but also somebody in the charity sector. So you tend to sort of allude to things that are happening, like with the scene of the teenage boys being kind of taken away, and, you know, it's left to the reader to kind of fill in the gaps, and we know what's going on. And so as the author, you haven't explicitly told us, and I'm grateful that I didn't have to read those words. And again, I think in Songbirds, you don't actually talk about what physically happened. to the women.
Yeah.
And again, we know and we can use our imagination, especially I think as women, we can use our imagination to fill in those gaps. And I think that's really, really important. And not every author does that. There are books that go into extreme levels of detail about suffering. So tell me a little bit about that, kind of how you strike that balance and why that's so important to you.
I think I just don't want to disrespect anybody. And that's the thing that's always in the foreground of my mind, because I think these are really sensitive issues and I don't want to sensationalize anything. I don't want it to be like, look at this, you know, I don't want to put anything more onto it. Or like, I think the thing with the boys, when I heard about what was going on in Athens, I thought it was one of the most horrific things I'd heard. And I thought, I don't want to not include it because it's real and it's happening. And, you know, I heard these stories and then I researched them. I read articles. I wanted to make sure that what people had told me was actually the reality of what was happening. But I didn't want to like go into it. I just wanted to, I wanted the reader to see it somewhere in the background and understand that this is where these situations can lead. You know, somewhere there's a war, somewhere there's refugees that are stuck. And from there, more bad things happen because people become desperate. Because like Nadim, for example, there's a scene where he's cutting his wrists because there are a lot of people, not now, you know, it's not to excuse why people get into these, you know, it's not to excuse, oh, people are doing these things because they're desperate, because there's other people that are desperate that don't get into child prostitution, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
However, these situations bring out the worst in people. And I think Nadim in the story is one of those, and he does cut his wrists out of guilt. But I didn't, and I wanted to show these little things, like there's these boys and you don't quite know what they're doing, but then you realize you put two and two together, you understand what's going on. But I didn't want to go any more explicitly into it because I didn't want to disrespect the children that it was happening to. And again, with Songbirds, the real women died, and I didn't want to disrespect, you know, the stories about Nisha and what she meant to this family and how this family learned to understand what she meant to them. It's not about this killer or how did he, you know, it's not about, you know, these, it's like, you know, when someone dies, you don't want to remember them on their deathbed. You want to remember how they were before. Yeah. So I feel that it would be disrespecting these women to be explicit about how they died, or, you know, what I found more respect for in telling the story is to show how much Nisha was really loved but not understood. So that I put all my focus and all my heart there, and then there was that, you know, I didn't want to put any focus on the other things. However, I did want the reader to understand that these women died in a very horrific way, in a way that they absolutely did not, what nobody deserves to, you know, and let alone that, but then they weren't searched for. So I wanted the reader to understand that, but without me giving an image or you know, anything like that. Because the most important thing to me is to be respectful and sensitive to these really difficult issues.
Did you ever, like, especially when you were in Athens, were you concerned about how you may portray those stories when you were writing about them?
See, at the time, like, so the first year when I was there, I wasn't writing. Yeah. It's just all the emotion made me kind of well up and go, you know, like the question you asked me before, then what makes me write? And so I was like, I kept getting this picture in my head of this man and this woman, and they'd lost their child and she was blind. And then when I got back to the UK, these characters sort of came to life and they started talking to each other. And I was like, I've just got to write this. And then it just sort of clicked and it sort of grew, and then I couldn't not write it. So when I went back the second year, I was teaching English then, because the refugee centre where I worked had sort of moved on from being a drop-in centre to being an activity centre to help people to kind of, you know, to help them live and move forward in their lives. And I think that what had happened was that by the time I got back the second year, I was so involved in the emotions that I remember just thinking, as I remember I questioned it because I'd started learning Arabic at that point as well with an Arabic tutor. And I was saying to him, because I can't go to Syria, I can't and I kept saying to him, I want to stop writing this. What right have I got to write it? And I'd told him about my family as well, and how connected I felt, and how overwhelmed I'd felt with emotion. And because he knew all the things I'd felt, he was like, just don't stop writing it. Your heart is telling you. So he was telling me to keep going, whereas somebody else might have been like, no, that's not your culture or something. But he was like, no, this is a thing of the heart. You need to write it. So because it came from my heart, I think when I went back to Athens, I was just like, in a way, I was remembering what he was saying to me. And I was like, as long as I am true to what my heart is telling me, as cliched, as silly as that sounds, but I just kept thinking, as long as I'm real with that, and I keep going with my heart and not with, oh, I want to write an amazing story. I want to, that instead of having that as an intent, just have the intention of, I'm writing with my heart because I understand this universal pain in some way, and I want to understand it more. So by going with that intention, I guess that intention led the way, if you know what I mean. I think sometimes it's about intention, and then that leads you in I suppose in the right direction.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I mean, it's really nice the way that you said it, because I think had you become focused on, no, I need to write X number of words, I need to write a book that's going to sell, I need to write a book that includes X, Y, and Z because I know publishers like it, then I guess your intentions would have been somewhat blurred. But it sounds like you were just so focused on telling the story that had come from within you because of the experiences that you had, and based on where you've come from before as well. So I think that's so lovely.
There was one publisher, like when you sort of are thinking to sell your books to publishers, I remember there was one publisher I spoke to that wanted to add a lot of kind of, oh, I want to, for example, it was like, oh, the refugees, when they're in the camps, where do they go to the toilets? We want more stuff like that. And and it was like, I want to see more of the suffering. And I remember thinking, but that doesn't feel right to me. Why do we need to do that? Why? I mean, why? What is anyone going to learn if I add those things, apart from almost becoming voyeuristic? And I just didn't agree. And anyway, we didn't go with her because it just didn't fit with it. I just didn't fit with the way I was looking at things and experiencing things. So we went with a publisher or Bonnier, but Kate Parkin. The minute I spoke to her, I just knew she understood what was going on inside me.
Oh, that's so lovely.
Yeah.
So lovely. Yeah. And I think that's something that I see us struggle with a lot in the charity sector as well. It's something personally I have major issues with how much, when it comes to suffering, how much do we need to show people? And how explicit do we need to be about things? And I think a lot about the people that we're showing, the photos of the people that we're taking, and the videos, the interviews that we're conducting as well. It's the thing that I struggle with the most, and I think we have a long way to go in getting that balance right.
It's so hard.
It's really tough. Do
you want people to know exactly that people are suffering, but at the same time you want to do it in a way where everyone's dignity is intact?
Exactly.
It is hard. It's really hard. But I trust my own, again, I feel like I'm sounding really cliched, but I kind of trust my own heart and other people's hearts. And I think if we do it with the right intentions, I think it usually, those right intentions shine through at the end of the day. I have a trust in that. I have a faith in it.
I think I have drawn a similar conclusion as well. I feel like my own judgment and my own feeling is probably the right one in terms of where we should draw the line. If I look at an image and I think this is too much, it's probably too much.
Yes. It's just about, we have to follow our gut instincts, don't we? And listen to ourselves. If something goes, if we go backwards, then there's something telling us,
Absolutely.
To kind of wake up and think about it.
So Songbirds obviously is about this really terrible incident that happened in Cyprus. And not only is it about a terrible incident, but it's about the fact that when these women disappeared, nobody were looking for them purely because they were foreigners, right?
Yeah.
And so you've written this beautiful book about a country that you are from, but a country that you love, but it highlights something that was difficult or was bad almost. And I can imagine that must have been quite difficult for you to grapple with. How do we almost criticize something that we love so much? What was that like for you?
Well, and I have the same feeling about people as well as places. I don't think we ever only love someone or something. We always have mixed feelings. Yeah. So I've always had mixed feelings about Cyprus. And so when there's so many things about Cyprus that I love, and there's so many things that I actually honestly detest as well. And all the shades in between. But when I received this article from my friend, the thing that upset me the most was that I wasn't shocked. So it was something that was already in the atmosphere. It was there, and I could see it from when I was a little girl. And I know it happens everywhere, but I found it more explicit in Cyprus. People tried less to hide it. It goes on everywhere, but you know, racism exists everywhere. But and the thing what saddened me the most about Cyprus as well, because my PhD, I looked at kind of Cyprus's colonial and post-colonial history, that actually Cyprus had been subjugated. The Cypriots had been subjugated. Yeah. The Cypriots had, in a way, been foreigners in their own land, you know, and were made to feel that they weren't good enough and that somebody had to come in and fix their country, and, you know, in the way that Britain did with many other places. And so they knew what it was like to feel misunderstood and undermined and all of those things. And yet, and I think that's what made me, the more I learned about the history of Cyprus, the more angry I got to say, well, hold on a minute, if you understand what all these things feel like, why do you then do it to others?
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So I guess I always had that kind of anger bubbling inside me about Cyprus, and I could really see it. And so many people have got domestic workers, and I could see how they were treating domestic workers. And what I found particularly interesting is that Sri Lanka was also a British colony.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of the domestic workers were from Sri Lanka. And I was like, you guys have got like really similar history. So why, you know, why is it, and why is there not this empathy, this understanding? Why is there this, oh, look at us, we're better kind of attitude, which is what I could see. So when the maids went missing, I was absolutely sad and horrified at what had happened, but not shocked that nobody had searched for them. Because I'd seen it over the years develop, and, you know, just always having these kind of thoughts of, well, why do these attitudes exist? And also realizing that sometimes these attitudes can become habits. Yeah. That actually it's not always malicious. Sometimes it becomes a habit to see something in a particular way. And that why isn't, I don't know, there was but however, when I told my auntie that I was writing this story, she said to me, oh, but you're going to make Cyprus look bad. And I said, I'm not going to do anything. As in, yeah, I'm writing the story, but I'm not making anything look bad. I'm just portraying what's there.
Yeah.
You know, so
yeah.
Exactly. And the other thing I said to her, it's everywhere. You're not going to find one place in the world where there isn't good and bad, beautiful and ugly,
absolutely,
dark and light. You know, it's everywhere.
Absolutely. So, yeah. Because it's something I struggle with a lot as well. So so my family's from Pakistan, and I actually lived there for 2 years.
Right.
And I love Pakistan, I really do. But there are things that happen in the country. There are some ideas and some practices and some values that I absolutely detest. Like I find it awful. And really sad things, really horrifying things happen. And like you, increasingly, I'm less and less surprised, very saddened, but less and less surprised. And if ever like I share something on social media or I say something, I sometimes get people say to me that, you should be less negative, should be less negative about Pakistan. But I feel like Pakistan should be less negative, that I don't have anything to say.
Exactly.
Because it's not me that's doing it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really truly believe that like you cannot have loving something does not mean to look at it with rose-tinted glasses. It's not to ignore its faults.
Absolutely.
It's to help improve them.
Yeah.
And like helping to become better. And it's just, I think, I think it's really important actually that, because if you wrote the story of Songbirds because, well, not because, but you know so much about the country, and also you have your own experiences. You mentioned once that there was a domestic worker that you were very good friends with as well, so that must have fed so well into the narrative, and it really brought it to light. And I mean, I didn't know that had happened in Cyprus. I know that it happens around the world. So it made me intrigued, and I looked things up because of it, and I kind of had conversations with people about it. So I think hopefully it will achieve something as well.
I hope so.
So one of the major themes in your writing is this idea about the value that we place on life, on people. And I guess in Beekeeper, the main thing is that, how can people that are literally just fleeing for safety, like all they want is to live in safety, how is it that they have to endure so much, and then when they arrive on safer land are still not fully accepted, and they have to go through so much even with the asylum seeking process. And then again with Songbirds, we have a look at this. Well, if the domestic workers were from Cyprus, there would have been a search party, the police would have gotten involved.
Exactly. Can you imagine there not being? I mean,
exactly. And I think increasingly, because there's so much conflict and crisis around the world, I'm really disappointed and I think frustrated with so much of the language that we see around refugee communities. But obviously I think we had a little bit of a shift, a little bit of a change recently with the crisis in Ukraine as well. And I don't know, like I find it really alarming that we're not all just considered people, and we're not just all considered people that deserve safety and happiness and a good life. How do you, and obviously like these are like core things in your writing, but how do you feel about that, and how do you try and channel that when you are writing?
What the idea of these values the values that I have about, so I guess it's actually a hard question because I don't know how. I guess it goes back to what we were talking about before, when you really sort of care about something. And so that when I'm writing, I write with my own emotions. So for example, what you're saying, that we all have the right to a safe life, to be somewhere safe, or we have a right to not feel hated for our religion or the color of our skin or something else, and I guess, I don't know, in some way I feel like it comes back to my mum. So my mum died 14 years ago. And, I had again, it's like what we were talking about before. She was absolutely lovely, but we had a normal mother and daughter relationship where we argued and we had fun and we laughed, and, it was good and it was bad and it was whatever, But she had one of the wonderful things about my mum was that she had this this empathy, this real love for people and animals, like real, like I remember it and I just think, God, it was so real. Like it wasn't, she didn't put it on or she didn't exaggerate it. It was real. Like I knew when I looked into her eyes that she really cared about people, and even people she didn't know. So, she'd watch something on the news and she'd cry because somebody had lost their home, or they hadn't seen their sister for so many years because somehow they'd been separated, or, and she felt it didn't matter what color people were or what nationality they were or what religion they were. To her, they were just all people. And I could see from a little girl that that's how she was responding. And animals the same. So if she was watching TV and those adverts, the RSPCA adverts came on, I could see that she, so I think I kind of like, that was one of the really wonderful things about my mum, and it sort of stayed with me. So I think without realizing it, I sort of picked up her way of looking at things. And then when I see someone like trying to strive for a better life or trying to strive to reach safety, it reminds me, like, what if that was me, or what if that was somebody I loved, or what if, so I think then what happens is I then try and put these values, without realizing they go into the story that I'm writing. Somehow it just sort of reminds me of my mum, that kind of way of looking at the world.
Oh, that's really nice. That is really nice. And so obviously when we listen to the news, or, we're on social media, we're constantly flooded with sad stories and statistics and really horrifying news. And I guess, we feel sad or we feel helpless. But I think when it is so much, we run the risk of also becoming a bit numb.
Yeah.
Or a bit, like just not as affected by it, or a bit like apathetic. Do you have any tips or any thoughts on how we can sort of try to stay in touch with our emotions around these things?
It's really hard, because I feel like for a few years after I came back from volunteering, and this goes back to what we spoke about earlier, I couldn't take for granted that I was alive. I was walking around constantly aware that I was in this country, and there were children that were trying to get here or trying to get somewhere else, and they were stuck in these camps, and I just couldn't take it for granted. And in a way, it broke me. And I feel guilty saying that, because I think, well, why should it have broken me? Because I'm not the one that was living in that camp. And I think we try and, without realizing, we protect ourselves from being broken by these things. And I realize now, like, say I'm flicking through Facebook and something comes up about Syria, or about Ukraine, or about something else that I know would affect me. I've noticed myself do it. I flick past. I don't stop. And then a few flicks down, I realize that I've done it, and I flick back up. Right? And I say, why did I dismiss it? And then I realize it's because sometimes it's just too much, and or sometimes I've seen it so many times that I've become immune to it. And I don't know how to change that, because I don't really know how to change it myself. How I changed it myself was that I went and volunteered, and then it wouldn't leave me, and it haunted me. And then eventually, sort of, it just, I don't know, I guess it kind of became less and less and less present in my mind. Is that a good thing? It meant that I felt more sane. It's such a difficult thing, because I honestly do it as well. And I think on the one hand is a protective mechanism, and on the other way, we're bombarded with things, and especially the way the media represent things. It can be so non-specific and so kind of, it's all crisis, rather than here's one person's story, here's another. So I guess, right, so I've reached a conclusion about how I'm going to answer this now. I've kind of like, I'm feeling my way in the dark trying to answer a question, but I would say the best way is to read real life stories or watch real life stories. So read memoirs or read fiction that really touches things at their core somehow, or watch a documentary where you really hear people's stories and not just these kind of news flashes and blah blah blah, and like loads of statistics and things like that are the kind of things that I think make us become immune or make us overwhelmed like that.
Oh, that's really that's really great. And I read, actually, maybe you did an interview, somebody asked you, why did you choose to write fiction instead of like, you know, some essays or
Yeah.
like a memoir type thing.
Yeah.
And you spoke about the importance of storytelling
Yeah.
and how you did it. Well, actually, tell us why.
So I just think that storytelling, well, it depends what kind. So I think memoir is very good because in a way it's bringing a real life situation and telling it like a story that people can relate to. And then you have fiction where you're completely making up the characters. The great thing about memoir, so I try and read real life stories, is that you're usually reading one or two people's experience, and you can walk in their shoes and feel what they're feeling, and it really kind of hits you if it's well written. The beauty of fiction is that you're not tied to a real life story, but what you are tied to is the emotional truth. Right. So if that's what you want to portray, this emotional truth that you perceive to be that emotional truth, like for example, when I was writing Beekeeper, the pain, what it meant to be in a situation where you've lost so much, you know, that emotional truth. How do you go about doing it if it's a piece of fiction? If it's fiction, you have more choice, you have more freedom in how you're going to shape the story to reveal that emotional truth. With non-fiction, you're more limited, but it can be just as powerful, but in a different way. And I guess with things like articles, I think you're more limited in a way, and there isn't that thing of the storytelling where the reader is going to open that book day after day and live with those people, live with those characters. And I think that is what the beauty of storytelling is, whether it's memoir or documentary or fiction, that you have this, you know, this thing where you live with those characters for a while, especially with novels and memoirs. You're not going to watch it in an hour or two. You're going to live with that book for a week, or I'm a really slow reader, so sometimes for a month.
Well, I will often, like with Beekeeper, I put down Beekeeper and I was thinking about it for months afterwards. You close the book and they don't leave you.
That's the other thing, isn't it? Those characters then live with you. Those people live with you after. And you often don't forget them.
Okay, I have one more question. I'm conscious we're running out of time, and I could talk to you all day. I have loved talking to you.
Me too. I feel like I can really talk to you all day as well.
But my question actually is just a short one. Do you have any plans for any more writing anytime soon? Can we expect something else?
Yeah, I mean, so it's hard because I've got a newborn baby and she's 14 weeks. Her name's Evie. So it is hard, but I would say that I do manage to do like a paragraph or so every 3 days or 4 days. Actually, I haven't written anything all week, but I do. What I was interested in, I went to Greece last year and spoke to people about the experiences of the fires that had happened.
Oh, okay.
So I was really interested, and I'm still interested in the kind of local effects of global warming. So, you know, like in Greece, forest fires, thousands of them happen, but they have got so tragically bad, like what happened in Madi and what happened in Evia, where ancient forests just vanished because of the fire. Luckily in Evia nobody died, but in Madi people lost their lives. And you know, I went to speak to people because I wanted to understand what it felt like, especially for people who hadn't left and they were living in the place that had, you know, that had changed beyond recognition to them. So I've started a story about a family who live inside a forest that's been burnt.
Oh wow.
So to be completely honest, I'm not 100% sure where the story's going, but I'm just like, oh my God, I've got a baby, and I you know, I'm really passionate about this and want to do it, but then I sit down to write and I just feel like my brain's not working. So, but I know that this is the story I want to tell. It's just a matter of giving myself a little bit more time and space to, you know, to kind of deal with motherhood and and, not rush it, not kind of force myself to write when I'm not feeling up to it, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Well, that sounds brilliant. And congratulations once again.
Thank you.
On the little baby. Such lovely news. But thank you so much for your time today, taking away precious time as a new mother.
You. I've loved it. It's lovely to be able to do things like this. And like I said to you as well, you're amazing to talk to. Honestly, I feel like we could have a cup of tea and just chat all night. So thanks so much for inviting me to do this.
Right. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you so much to Christy for her time and wisdom. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media.